The HIV Stigma Index is an international standardized tool to gather data on how stigma and discrimination impact the lives of people living with HIV. This project was developed by a partnership between the International Planned Parenthood Federation and the Global Network of People Living with HIV, the International Community of Women Living with HIV, and the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. First launched in 2008, the HIV Stigma Index has since been implemented in more than 100 countries. Well over 100,000 people living with HIV have been interviewed by 1,600 trained peer researchers. It's the world's largest social research project developed and implemented by people living with HIV. While our international collaborations ground this important project, my colleagues and I at the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions, which is a world-leading research center dedicated to tackling complex urban health issues, and Reach Nexus, a national network and broker of pragmatic solutions with a common goal of ending Canada's HIV epidemic. Together, we are the teams responsible for this study's implementation, ongoing execution and analysis, and ultimately, the invaluable knowledge transfer and exchange resulting from it. This video will focus on the Canadian implementation of the Stigma Index, and more specifically on Ontario, and the data collected in the Greater Toronto Area. We will also discuss our approach to working with peer researchers and their importance to the ongoing success of this study in the fight against HIV stigma. My name is James Watson, and I'm the National and Ontario Coordinator for the HIV Stigma Index here in Canada. I've been living with HIV for over 25 years, and unfortunately, like all people living with HIV, I'm also a bit of an expert at living with HIV stigma. Ending HIV stigma in Canada is going to be one heck of a battle, but I'm encouraged by this study. The HIV Stigma Index, with its multi-pronged, community-led approach championed by peer researchers, is going to go a long way to win this fight. With community members leading the charge, we can produce meaningful results and move them quickly into action. And I think that history has proven that when people living with HIV are organized and mobilized, we are a powerful force to be reckoned with. Another unique dimension to this study is that it's been created as a contact-based intervention, meaning that the peer-to-peer interview experience is an intentional exchange of knowledge and lived experience meant to build resiliency. This is a study that fights stigma in real time, peer-to-peer. Let's have a look at the study objectives. We want to understand how the social determinants of health are interacting with stigma, and why some people experience stigma differently or are more resilient than others. We also want to have a look at where stigma is more prevalent geographically and structurally. Why are we still experiencing stigma in our medical system? But of course, the most exciting objective is mobilizing the data into action. Community champions and academic researchers working side by side to develop meaningful and measurable interventions. A surefire way of bringing about almost immediate social change for people living with HIV is by hiring and training and working with them as peer researchers. And one of the central tenets of our peer researcher approach is the recognition that the lived experiences of people living with HIV are equal in value to academic achievement, that their lived experience is expertise. These concepts around value and meaningful engagement are really powerful and empowering. Peer researchers complement and complete the scientific research process and have become one of the most important drivers and the spirit of health research in Canada. We wouldn't be where we are today without the peer researcher movement. As we talk about peer research, I think we need to understand how we got here. The HIV sector is certainly a trailblazer in the peer researcher movement, and one of the key factors of its success is because, unlike some other research communities, ours is grounded in a fight for our lives, in activism. All peers, really, in the HIV sector stand on the shoulders of giants, of the activists of the 80s, who demanded that we be meaningfully involved in the processes and systems that affected our future. It was from this fight for meaningful engagement that eventually, of course, produced the JIPA-MIPA principles, or the greater and meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. And these principles, that have been adopted by the United Nations, call for the active and meaningful participation of people living with HIV in all aspects of policies and programs, including the research that affects them. And the Stigma Index is a prime example of JIPA and MIPA in action. And our peer researchers lead the way.
I think that peer researchers are catalysts of change, like that in a way. It's like I really love community-based research. I like the idea of it. I like the values of it and the goals of it and how it's supposed to transform a community. I think community-based research is a transformative thing, both for individuals and for community. And I really like being a part of that. And I think that being a peer researcher, you're right at the ground floor, the grassroots of it all. Like, we're the ones who see the actual people that the research is about. So if I do a fabulous interview and that person goes away feeling good, then I know that, like, I was a part of something good.
Peer researchers working in the HIV Stigma Index, like in many community-based research studies, have day-to-day duties, and these include screening and recruiting participants, seeking informed consent, collecting the data using a variety of different methods, keeping the data safe and confidential, completing administrative duties, and contributing to the data analysis and the dissemination of findings. But the peer researcher role is a complex one, with emotional twists and turns. Being so close to the subject matter and without proper supports can be stressful and triggering and lead to emotional burnout. We expect peer researchers, and pay them, to constantly externalize and reflect upon and apply their lived experience to their work through all phases of the research. They perform a type of emotional labor and are expected to be highly attuned to people living with HIV from all walks of life. And with this emotional labor, almost always comes disclosure. In an interview setting, peer researchers disclose strategically to encourage participants to offer deeper and more truthful responses. They disclose to the research team members in committees and meetings, and often in dissemination activities. But this constant disclosure and emotional labor is not easy, and requires a support structure that offers both formal and informal supports.
You're left in this position of trust where you're carrying this person's story, except it's one person's story and 10 people's story and 20 people's story, and you're carrying all these stories that impact your heart. And unless you're really skilled at finding support and accessing support and giving away these people's gifts to you, you walk around carrying their pain. You take their pain from them, but then you carry it.
As patient engagement and peer research becomes more mainstream, it's opening broad and exciting discussions around equity and sustainability, as well as the unique support needs peer researchers might need to thrive in this complex and demanding role. In the HIV Stigma Index, we are working hard to be on the leading edge of peer researcher support. Over the years, we've developed a PRA support framework that guides how we work with peer researchers, which allows for meaningful engagement at all levels of the research process. This framework moves JIPA theory into meaningful practice and has 6 broad components of support: administrative, educational, economic, emotional and self-care, cultural, and methodological. If you'd like to learn more, I recommend reading our paper authored by myself and Dr. Francisco Ibanez Carrasco, titled Supporting Peer Researchers, Recommendations from Our Lived Experience, Expertise in Community-Based Research in Canada, in the Harm Reduction Journal. The benefits to the research of working with peer researchers are extraordinary. If our peer researchers are supported appropriately to thrive, they can provide first-hand issue expertise and help bridge that knowledge between the community and academic researchers. We rely on our peer researchers to help recruit harder-to-reach populations and create an interview environment that's supportive and encouraging, where participants feel comfortable to share their lived experiences openly. And all of this enhances the quality of the data we collect. Our peer researchers help legitimize our study by standing confidently as an integral and outward-facing part of our study team. We're at various stages of implementing the HIV Stigma Index across the country and scaling up a number of ongoing stigma-related projects in the provinces. But in Ontario specifically, we've hired and trained 15 peer researchers who have completed 724 quantitative interviews in 5 regions of the province. We are now conducting data analysis, disseminating findings, as well as mobilizing various KTE products through the Positive Effect website, social media, and the HIV Stigma community of practice. We're also about to launch a second phase of online quantitative data collection. Let's turn our attention to the survey tool. The core survey questions are kept the same across the country and around the world, but questions are added to capture regional priorities in each of the provinces. The core survey sections reveal the wide range of issues explored related to HIV stigma. They include topics like resiliency and experiences of stigma, social support and life engagement, disclosure, internalized stigma, and interactions with healthcare services. We've also added validated measures to the survey. We added validated measures to the survey so we could compare and quantify key determinants of health. Validated measures are questions that have been independently proven to accurately measure a certain construct and are often used in population health surveys. Some examples of these scales include Bunn's Adapted HIV Stigma Scale that explores different types of stigma. It measures internalized, perceived, and enacted stigma. The Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale that's used to measure a person's ability to bounce back from certain negative situations. And Mallory's Healthcare Empowerment Scale, used to measure a person's level of engagement in their own healthcare management.
My name is Jason Lo Hoc Tian, and I'm a graduate student working on the data analysis for the HIV Stigma Index, and I'm going to go through a brief overview of the preliminary findings from the study. First, we'll take a look at a breakdown of our sample. There were 341 participants from the Greater Toronto Area. The average age was 47, and we had quite an experienced sample with an average of 14 years living with HIV. The majority of participants had completed more than high school education. For sexual orientation, most people were gay or lesbian, with just under a third heterosexual, and we even had a small percentage of bisexual individuals. More than half of the sample were Caucasian, but we did meet recruitment targets for other key populations, including African, Caribbean, and Black individuals, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous peoples. The focus of the HIV Stigma Index is of course stigma, which is a complicated and multifaceted social process. To capture the nuances of stigma, we break it down into different dimensions or types, and examine how they each interact with other mechanisms and with each other to impact health outcomes. Internalized stigma is the shame and guilt that forms when people accept negative assumptions about their character because they have HIV. Almost half of the participants had significant levels of internalized stigma.
The more I worked with issues on stigma, I realized that I self-stigmatized myself. But my whole purpose of getting involved in HIV's work was to put a face and a story to the virus. And I have been doing that all along, so why do it now?
Enacted stigma involves experiences of discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping from others because of your HIV status. About 6 out of 10 people had significant enacted stigma.
The reality is, and the purpose of this study is, that that's not what our world is like. People die, people get killed, people get bashed, people lose their jobs, people lose their housing. Like, those things happen today. People suffer if they disclose their status, because the world is full of stigma.
And lastly, anticipated stigma is about the expectation of discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping from others in the future due to your HIV status. This was the most common type of stigma, with 85% of the sample experiencing significant levels of anticipated stigma. Overall, the rates we're seeing tells us that HIV stigma is alive and well, and affects a large proportion of our sample in many ways. Let's take a brief detour to look at health. One way we capture an individual's overall health and well-being is through self-reported health. This is commonly elicited using one question. In general, how would you rate your health? And participants can respond from poor to excellent. This has been shown to predict key health outcomes such as mortality, disability, comorbidities, and use of healthcare services, which makes it an efficient way to gain information about how someone is doing. We decided to examine the relationship between stigma and self-rated health, and here we can see how different types of stigma can have different effects. For those who rate their health as poor, 3/4 had significant levels of internalized stigma. This decreases to 40% for those who rate their health as excellent. A similar pattern can be seen with enacted stigma. Rates of enacted stigma decrease by almost half for people who rate their health as excellent compared to those who rate it as poor. This tells us that internalized and enacted stigma may significantly contribute to self-rated health and by extension real-life health and well-being. On the other hand, anticipated stigma remains relatively high regardless of self-rated health. This may mean that the expectation that others will treat you poorly because of your HIV status is not really linked to overall health. It may impact an individual in another way. Now let's look at the rates of some other social and health factors that may have important interactions with stigma and pose a risk to health and well-being. 18% of our sample had significant alcohol use, 28% had significant drug use, and 37% had significant depression. Levels of socioeconomic factors were higher still. Over half of our sample have lacked basic needs such as food, shelter, and clothing. 6 out of 10 are unemployed, and 3/4 have an income below $30,000. This gives you a picture of the variety of challenges that people living with HIV in our sample are facing. Dealing with any one of these alone can pose a challenge, and unfortunately, these health risks often co-occur. We decided to create a health risk score by adding up the number of health risks each person had. When examining the impact of these health risks on levels of stigma, we can see that they have an additive effect. Those who had 0 of those health risks were less likely to experience significant levels of internalized or enacted stigma. The rates of these two types of stigma increase steadily as you continue to add health risks. People who have 4 or more health risks were more than twice as likely to experience internalized and enacted stigma. As we have seen before, anticipated stigma remains high and does not appear to be affected by the number of health risks one experiences. We also looked at some factors thought to protect or buffer against the negative impact of stigma. We examined social support, which is the extent to which you have the support of others to face stressful situations, resiliency, or the ability to bounce back after stressful events, tragedy, or trauma, and self-efficacy of treatment, or one's ability to adhere to treatment plans. Over half of the sample had moderate or high levels of social support. More than 2/3 had moderate or high resiliency, and 9 out of 10 people had moderate or high self-efficacy. This shows that there are significant levels of these protective factors at people's disposal, and these resources could help with coping. Of course, there are still improvements to be made, and there is a significant proportion of people with low levels of these protective factors, especially social support. Like for the health risks, we added up the number of protective factors each person had. This time, if a person had moderate levels of a protective factor, they got 1 point, and if they had high levels, they got 2. We then examined how the types of stigma changed with the number of protective factors. Levels of internalized and enacted stigma decreased significantly with each added protective factor. This shows that social support, resiliency, and self-efficacy, all of which can be taught and learned, may have significant potential to decrease levels of stigma. There was even a minor decrease in rates of anticipated stigma, which has remained consistently high so far, for those who had multiple protective factors, again highlighting the potential for stigma to be reduced. To summarize, when looking at the rates in our sample, we can see that HIV stigma is alive and well, affecting people living with HIV in different ways. We looked at the different types of stigma and found that internalized and enacted stigma have a significant impact on an individual's overall health and well-being. We also saw how other mental health, substance use, and socioeconomic risk factors can add up to contribute to higher levels of stigma. Lastly, we examined resiliency, social support, and self-efficacy, and saw that these factors have the potential to reduce the burden of stigma on the lives of people living with HIV.
You might already be thinking of how to continue this conversation or get involved in something to reduce HIV stigma in your community. While there are lots of things to do, here are a few things that we're engaged with that we're encouraging others to rally around as well. On a personal level, it's important for us to continue to challenge misconceptions of HIV and pay attention to our biases, and encourage the use of inclusive language in all aspects of our lives. By remaining aware of stigma's impact and understanding how it spreads, either consciously or unconsciously, we can all play a role in improving the health and well-being for people living with HIV. Highlighted in the video, we saw that strong social support can reconcile or mediate the negative impacts associated with stigma. We all have a role to play here. So are there things that we can do to be a better friend, a better neighbor, or community member? There are some good programs and work opportunities for community members, but we need to continue to strengthen and develop these programs and create policies that support capacity building and meaningful employment for people living with HIV.
Any of the things that I've gone through that have made me examine my value system and what's important to me and how I want to live my life have been a positive effect.
To be open about something that's so personal for me and that affects me, not just today, but for the rest of my life.
And I'm positive, I'm trans, and I'm happy.
ThePositiveEffect.org was born from a desire to share the stories of people living with HIV and their allies, to spark dialogue and communicate around issues related to stigma. It provides a collaborative and creative platform for people's voices and stories and experiences to be heard, and creates an opportunity for all of us to connect. We hope that this video will inspire you to submit a story or share an experience related to the topics discussed. Visit the Positive Effect website or email hello@positiveeffect.org for more information.
And if I can help others in whatever way, that to help eliminate that stigma, to put a face to HIV, to realize that HIV doesn't define me. I am Mary. I am a mother, a grandmother. I am a friend, a colleague, and I could be your next door neighbor, the person you work with, and HIV should not be something that we're afraid of. HIV can I hope that I can help overcome that stigma.